This wasn't just an engine, it was a mechanical monster. Part jet, part rocket, part science experiment that had somehow escaped the lab, roaring with a fury no street had ever seen before. Even today, engineers shake their heads at how Chrysler dared to unleash this beast on the road. It wasn't just unusual, it was borderline insane. The Chrysler Turbine engine wasn't just engineering, it was a glimpse into an alternate automotive reality, where cars didn't just run, they roared with turbine fury. It promised the impossible, a car powered like a jet, a car that didn't care what fuel you poured into it, a car that challenged everything we thought we knew about engines. What it truly was remains a mystery to most, a puzzle wrapped in steel and fire. This engine was an anomaly, a monstrous machine too wild, too untamed to exist among ordinary cars. Decades later, it still sparks questions, debates, and disbelief. Why did these incredible machines exist? And more importantly, why were they destroyed? The world wars had given the manufacturing industry an insane level of confidence, which seemed almost store-bought. These were the times when the markets were starting to boom. The markets that would have been called outdated by some a while back were starting to flourish. The world was being filled with innovations. The post-war mentality had people focus insanely on industries, and the automobile industry was no stranger to the common mindset. Chrysler's engines weren't just mechanics, they were wartime alchemists, turning the secrets of military jets into street-legal monsters. They took the roar of planes and tried to bottle it into a car, bending combustion, airflow, and spinning metal into something that felt illegal in its brilliance. But how did it get to this? There must have been some reason behind such an extreme innovation. Well, the market was filled with ambition. But what ambition quickly made way for was intense and brutal competition. Each and every company wanted more for themselves. Better technology, better business. But what these brands were truly hungry for was glory. GM and Ford had been major competitors of Chrysler for ages. Chrysler as a brand would love to eat all the competition completely. But the biggest hurdles in their way were these two. GM and Ford had started doing quite well for themselves. But from the way it seemed to Chrysler, they were doing a little too well. These competitors of Chrysler were beginning to eat up a lot of the market share that was previously dominated by Chrysler. The brand could not afford to lose any more of its business share, and the management was aware that to counter these monsters, they would have to come up with something truly extraordinary. To motivate Chrysler, the era was also calling for this engine. In the 50s and 60s, the entire world was going insane about the future. The people were obsessed with jets and space. The space was mainly to blame, but the people were at large all talking about the space and newer technology. In this age, Chrysler knew that introducing an insane machine like the turbine engine could result in a huge payday. The situation made sense, but how could they do it? It even sounds crazy, powering a car with a jet engine. Well, it didn't seem crazy to the people at Chrysler. Right after World War II ended, the engineers at Chrysler were already peeking into what they thought was going to be the future: turbine engines for cars. They began developing the ideas in 1945 without wasting any time. After 9 years of untamed efforts, in 1954, the first prototype was finally ready. The prototype seemed to work, but that was it. It could only function. There was nothing fascinating about it apart from the engine. There was a long way to go, and the people at Chrysler were very aware of that fact. The original piece was just a loud piece of junk that made way too much noise, and was a little too much for the average person. From 1956 to 1962, Chrysler went deep into this obsession. They wanted to make this machine a reality, and they were willing to go to any length they had to achieve their goals. There were multiple generations of test engines, all better than the ones before them. These modifications were focused on the amount of noise the car was making, and the engineers were also concerned about the fuel economy of the engines they would eventually be producing, as well as the emissions of the engine, as that was a major issue back then as well. The turbine engine was basically a regenerative gas turbine. The concept was to power a car the same way a jet powers a plane. The hot gases would expand, which would make the turbine move, which would then make the wheels of the car move. Unlike standard engines that would work on repeated combustion and pistons, this engine would work through constant combustion and rotating parts. To gain a better understanding of this odd machine, it must be examined closely. One of the primary things in this engine was the airflow of the engine. Airflow is primarily important in engines already, but it was a little more important in this one. The air for this engine was drawn completely from the atmosphere via a large air intake in the front. This air was crucial to supply oxygen for the combustion to actually happen. The turbine engine was designed to intake large volumes of air, which was crucial for combustion and compression. Compression was also an integral part of this engine, enabling it to function. The part used for this process was a single-stage centrifugal compressor. This compressor was used to compress air and send it to the respective chambers for combustion. This made a whole lot of sense if one pays attention to it. This part single-handedly helped the engine cut down parts like the pistons and other internal components. Compressing the air would increase the oxygen density in the air, which would also help with better combustion and result in unreal power, which was insane for a mad project like this engine. There were now only a few spinning blades that would do this job for the entire engine. The combustion chamber wasn't like the ones people were used to either. There was an annular, meaning ring-shaped, chamber surrounding the engine shaft. The process inside the chamber was also quite simple. The compressed air would enter the chamber, then fuel would be sprayed on the walls and would be ignited. Once the fuel is ignited, continuous combustion would steadily burn the fuel, which would expand the gases. The most unique feature of this engine lies in this chamber as well. Well, this chamber was like a trash can, but a very productive one. You could put technically any flammable liquid in this beast, and it would make your car move. This engine couldn't care enough about what was being placed inside it. It could be gasoline, diesel, vegetable oil, and even tequila. Yes, tequila. This thing could practically run on anything. The fuel injectors were variable, and the combustion design was crafted with so much work that it resulted in this insanity. To cut down the fuel intake of the turbine, the engineers designed a system to recycle the hot air from the exhaust to preheat the compressed air. This helped the engine cut down its intake by a large number, which seemed barely possible for a turbine. The exhaust, however, was a big issue in the beginning. The air going out would be so hot at times that it could melt the pavement and seriously injure any bystanders if the driver was not super careful. In response, Chrysler used the regenerator, the same system that was meant to cut down fuel intake, which would also help make the air going out a lot cooler. The air was still insanely hot, but it was manageable now. It seems like this engine was perfect, right? Then what happened? Why was it taken down? And why doesn't the industry ever circle back to it? The complete story is a little complicated. Once the car was completed in 1963, Chrysler decided to do a public trial of the vehicles. They wanted to know if the cars were actually applicable in the real world. 55 vehicles, 5 prototypes, and 50 production cars were distributed to 203 people over a 2-year period. And the results the brand got back were not what they had expected. Even though the engine was able to run on anything, everything would run out. The hunger for this engine was too much, even for water. The mileage barely ever escaped teens, which was just not enough. The fuel economy of this thing was technically worse than any piston engine you could compare it with. There were lag issues as the cars would respond to acceleration very slowly. The vehicles were still fun to drive, but they were not quite the perfect competition against the type of service piston engines were providing people with. The engine was no doubt low in pollutants. This meant they did have emissions under control. Well, not really. The engine would put out fewer pollutants, but it would also throw out large amounts of nitrogen oxides, which soon became a bigger regulatory target. The government didn't directly attack the turbine engine, but the emission regulations they put out for public safety just didn't allow for a machine like this to roam around on the streets. Neither the other big manufacturers nor Chrysler wanted to dive into turbine technology and make it convenient for the streets. It was too much work. The pieces were called back, and out of 55, 46 were destroyed. 9, however, survived. These remains of a dream remain in museums to this day. whispering to the people about the turbine technology they abandoned. But the question is anyone listening? For more stories like these, subscribe to our channel. Let us know your thoughts on the turbine engine in the comments below. See you soon.